Welcome back to Mason Talk. So today I want to discuss a likely more realistic Cleveland Browns head coaching candidate, and that is their one of their next interviewees, Cincinnati Bengals offensive coordinator Dan Pitcher. Now, obviously not as big of a name as some of the others who have been tossed around, but the reasoning and the logic behind this interest is it's there. And the main reason why is because of a connection between Pitcher and Andrew Berry that goes back to the 2010s when they both worked together in player operations with the Indianapolis Colts. That's one thing that makes Pitcher kind of an interesting candidate, is that not only does he have, like a decade of coaching experience with the Bengals under his belt, but he also worked in the front office side of things. That's how he got his career started with the Indianapolis Colts. And, this might not be the flashiest candidate in the world. And I've seen a lot of people say, well, this seems more like the Browns just doing due diligence on, coordinators, on people who could come in and be your offensive coordinator for whoever's your next head coach. But when I look at the Browns' interest in Dan Pitcher, it points me towards a trend that I think is going to continue to grow in the NFL, and that's coordinators with no play calling experience, which Dan Pitcher falls into that category, getting head coaching jobs. And, that's one of the biggest knocks that you have against Dan Pitcher. He's worked for one organization for a long time, Cincinnati Bengals offensive side. He's done a whole bunch of different coaching assignments. He's been the coordinator for the last little bit here. But Zach Taylor, head coach, he is the play caller. He's calling the shots for the offense, and that turns a lot of people off. Why would you hire an offensive coordinator who doesn't call plays? But I think when you look at the landscape of the NFL right now, that reasoning, it's just simply not going to be effective as we move into the future, because I think we're going towards a realm where offensive coordinators in majority don't call plays. I think that play calling, as we've seen with more and more offensive head coaches, play calling is falling under their list of duties instead of offensive coordinator. I mean, think of all of the quote unquote offensive head coaches in the league. Like almost all of the high profile guys, whether it's Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay, of course. You look at the Browns, Kevin Stefanski called plays for most of his time here. If you're an offensive head coach, or if offense is where you really cut your teeth, in the league, like if you're an Andy Reid, you're going to want to call plays. You're going to want to come into your organization and call plays. So, offensive coordinator, it's going to be less and less of a play calling role as we move into the future. That's just how it's going to be. However, that should not stop teams from looking to the offensive side of the coaching staff for potential head coaching candidates. I mean, you look at how many coaches have come out of the Sean McVay tree, whether that be a Zach Taylor in Cincinnati, Kevin O'Connell with the Minnesota Vikings has had some success. You've had multiple coaches come out of Los Angeles from the offensive side of the football, and they don't call plays. They don't call plays. They're part of the offensive operation, but they don't call plays. And that's not the end all be all. And it's worked out for some teams, it hasn't for others. But when you look at a head coaching candidate who's an offensive coordinator or even defensive coordinator, play calling can't be all you're looking for. That's just simply not going to be all that you can consider of a candidate, because then you're going to be cutting yourself off from several potentially good candidates. And listen, I have no clue if Dan Pitcher's a good candidate. I have zero idea. I mean, he's got an interesting background. He's got a connection with Andrew Barry, which, whether or not it's fair, that gives him a leg up over some of these other, candidates that we've been hearing about. I have no clue if he's a good candidate, but you can't just say, oh, he doesn't call plays, then we can't consider him, because that's not going to be an option going into the future. I mean, you look at even Detroit, Dan Campbell. What if the Lions had said, we don't want him because he didn't call plays with the Saints? He was just the, associate head coach, tight ends coach, whatever his official title was. He just helped out the offense. I mean, I don't think that people consider fully what goes into coordinator jobs outside of play calling, because there's a lot. And then you look at head coaching, you can't just say, oh, this guy's a good play caller, then, therefore they're going to be a good coach. It's proven multiple times that is not the most important skill that you need to consider. Now, if you get a coach who's a fantastic play caller, then that's obviously a benefit. But when you look at Dan Pitcher, and, he's got 10 years of experience with one organization, which I personally appreciate that type of stability. He's obviously worked with one of the best quarterbacks in the league, Joe Burrow, which I think's it's a good, sign. There's a lot of things that you have to consider when you're hiring a head coach, and you can't just base it off how they do as a play caller, or if they call plays at all. Now, that makes it much harder to find a good head coach, because, back in the day you could just say, oh, this guy's good at calling offensive plays, so, we want an offensive coach, we'll pick him. That's not the case anymore. And that's why I am saying, lock John Harbaugh in a room and offer him, millions upon millions of yearly dollars, because, it's just going to be such a crapshoot every time you try to find a head coach, because I don't think coordinators are going to be as prominent as they once were in terms of a direct impact on a team. Like Ben Johnson is becoming more and more of an anomaly. Even you look at the Patriots. Mike Vrabel. I mean, he wasn't even a coordinator for the last year. He was working with the Browns, and he went to the Patriots, and just it's becoming more difficult to say, okay, best coordinators in terms of play calling. The team with the best defense will take his coordinator, and he'll become our coach. Like, that's why John Harbaugh, I mean, he's the guy. Not to make this into another John Harbaugh, love fest once again, but, a 18-year coach with a Super Bowl win, playoff appearances, a positive record, AFC North titles, like, that's the guy. If you're the Browns and you can get Harbaugh, that's the home run type of coach. But when you don't get Harbaugh, if you don't get Harbaugh, not that I don't think the Browns have a good enough, as good of a shot as any team to land John Harbaugh, but, if that doesn't work out, you're going to have to take a swing on a coach based on his, leadership, his intangibles. It becomes a much bigger crapshoot, I think, than what people give it credit it with, in terms of just the uncertainty. Like, a lot of people are saying, well, why wouldn't Jim Schwartz be the next guy up, because he's been so good defensively? But, like, we saw Schwartz with the Lions, and yes, he's gotten much more experience since then. That was like a decade ago that he was last a head coach, but yes, he's a fantastic defensive coordinator, but that doesn't necessarily tell you everything you need to know. Tommy Rees has gotten several inquiries from at least the collegiate level in terms of his desire or his potential in terms of being a head coaching candidate, and he didn't call plays, and he last year he was the tight ends coach on the Browns offense, and yet people have interest in him because of his personality, his style of leadership. I just think there's a lot more to these coaches than fans or the media or analysts are really able to determine. So when you look at a guy like Dan Pitcher, I think he has a legitimate shot to become the head coach of the Cleveland Browns, and it's because he worked with Andrew Berry. You have that connection. He's worked with at least a semi-stable franchise for the last decade in the Cincinnati Bengals. I mean, they have one more AFC title. They have 100% more AFC titles than the Browns have in their franchise history. So, in the last 5 years, they've gotten to the Super Bowl more than the Browns have ever. So, you look at a guy coming from that team, even if he doesn't call plays, who knows? He could be the greatest hidden gem coach anybody's ever seen. My main point being, finding a head coach is incredibly hard. And, when you see news that the Browns are planning to interview somebody like Dan Pitcher, I would be very hesitant to just discredit it as more of a coordinator interview than a head coaching interview. I think he has a legitimate shot to become the next head coach of the Cleveland Browns. But let me know in the comments, what do you think of Cincinnati Bengals offensive coordinator Dan Pitcher? Do you think he would be a good head coach for the Cleveland Browns? Thank you for listening to the Mason Talk Sports Show. I will see you in my next episode. Goodbye.